So, welcome everyone. Check my mic is on. Yes, it is. Welcome everyone to today's online event hosted by Studium Generale in Groningen. My name is Nina, and I invited Stefan Schevelier today to give a lecture about Johan Huizinga's famous work Homo Ludens. In English, that would translate to Playing Man. This lecture is the second one in a series about playing and games. On April 26th, archaeologist Walter Christ kicked off with a talk about his research on ancient board games. He works at Maastricht University and he is involved in the digital Lubricant project. Board games that are found at archaeological sites often lack a manual. We have no clue how they should be played. And Walter Christ and his group are able to use artificial intelligence to find out what the rules of these games are. And this way, the Digital Ludine project was able to upload around 1,000 ancient board games that you can actually play now. And as someone already mentioned in the chat, the recording of this talk will be online this week in the event page, which means the original event page on our website. I will send the link in a minute. This first talk was really about games as an archaeological finding, as artifacts. Where were they found? Where did people play them? What types of games did they play? And what did the games look like? And today we will dive into a more philosophical aspects of play and gaming in the modern world, with the central question, why do we play? And philosopher Stefan Schevelier will discuss this question in the light of the famous work by Johan Huizinga, as I mentioned, Homo Ludens. Stefan is also a lecturer and recruitment officer at the Radboud University in Nijmegen. And he actually made his own game, a democracy game called Demos, and he is interested in research in the philosophy of video games in general, which he will be talking about as well, the phenomenon of video games. Now, before we start, I wanted to point out that you can ask your questions during the talk or after the talk. You can write them down in the chat. And you can find the chat at the purple button in the right lower corner of your screen. The lecture will take about 45 to maybe 60 minutes, and after we'll get back to the questions. And if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, you can reach out to my colleague, who is named Studium Generale Technical Support, and Isa will try to help you out if you can. With that being said, I want to welcome you, Stefan, and invite you to start the lecture.
Hey, thanks. I'm gonna share my presentation first. And that works, I hope?
Yeah, it works.
Perfectly. Hi, yeah, so my name is Stefan Schevelier, and thank you for the introduction. Nina, you've invited me to come talk about the question, why do we play? I hope, I was first wondering, let's start with that. Go back, do a little poll first, see who my audience is. I'm curious to see. Oh, it erased my poll. Maybe just go to the chat then. I want to know, are you guys gamers or are you not? Are you experienced gamers? Have you never tried games before? Are you more into board games or more into video games? If you could let me know in the chat, I can take that into account as I go along. I'll keep an eye on the chat for that. So what's this lecture about? I was asked to talk about why we play, and especially to go into the question of why we started playing more since the pandemic. And it's clearly that we have. I've gone over a couple of news sites, kept check of them, and go back to my presentation, go to the next slide, show you some of the headlines that were you were able to see for the past year. Here are some of the biggest ones that should tell you that we've started gaming a lot more. Graphics cards are in shortage. There's a shortage of gaming cards. graphics cards. It's difficult to buy a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X console because they're sold out. That has to do with Bitcoin as well, I know, but it's also have to do with the fact that we've been gaming more than ever. Twitch, the video game streaming service, has been breaking records, gaining more views and more streamers than ever before. Steam, the place where you can play games, download them, buy them, has broken its record for most concurrent users, so gamers playing games at the same time. This headline said 25 million, but I think it's even, this record has been broken again as well. Fortnite producer Epic has even started a lawsuit with the biggest company in the world, Apple, because they're doing so well and they want to do better. So they've started a lawsuit to get the percentage that they have to pay to Apple to go down. Nintendo's breaking records, selling more Switches and having a breakout hit with Animal Crossing New Horizons, which even played a role in the political elections in the US last year. And on top of that, even board games and more analog games have seen a rise. Dungeons and Dragons, which was one of the nerdiest things that you could do when I grew up as a kid, is now gaining mainstream appeal. It's seen a rise last year of, I think it was 33% in revenue, based on its rising popularity, and that was even before COVID. So on the whole, there's a rise in play, I'd say. And the question for this lecture then is why? Why have we started playing more, but also why do we play? So can we answer that question of why we've started playing more from an anthropological perspective? That's what I'm going to try to do. So anthropology is the study of man, philosophical anthropology, the philosophical study of man. From that tradition, I'm going to try to say something about why we play. And the first place that we should start out with is not an anthropologist, but perhaps a philosopher of language, namely the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who's possibly the most one of the most famous philosophers anyway, but is also famous in when you talk to philosophers about games. This is often the philosopher they think about first. Because Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote a book called Philosophical Investigations in 1953, where he had this whole passage on games. And from that passage is derived this whole theory of language games. And in explaining that phenomenon of language game, he used a discussion, an example about games. And what I wanted to do is read that in full, because I think it's a classic when you talk about this topic, but it's also very instructive to get a sense of what's problematic in trying to define video games, because at the outset of this lecture, we're trying to look for a definition, right? So I'm going to start with the paragraph 66 of the Philosophical Investigation, and then it's going to be a short passage, so bear with me. Paragraph 66, quote, consider, for example, the proceedings that we call games. I mean board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say there must be something common, or they wouldn't be called games. But look and see whether there's anything common to all. For if you look at them, you will not see something that is common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. To repeat, don't think, but look. Look, for example, at board games with their multifarious relationships. Now pass to card games. Here you find many correspondences with the first group, but many common features drop out and others appear. When we pass next to ball games, much that is common is retained, but much is lost. Are they amusing? Compare chess with noughts and crosses. Or is there always winning and losing, or competition between players? Think of patience, patience. In ball games, there is winning and losing, but when a child throws his ball at the wall and catches it again, this feature has disappeared. Look at the parts played by skill and luck, and at the difference between skill in chess and skill in tennis. Think now of Ring of Roses. Here's an element of amusement, but how many other characteristic features have disappeared? I can go through the many other groups of games in the same way. And we can see how similarities crop up and then disappear. And the result of this examination is we see a complicated network of similarities, overlapping and crisscrossing, sometimes overall similarities, sometimes similarities of detail. Paragraph 68. And this is how we use the word game. For how is the concept of game bounded? What still counts as a game and what no longer does? Can you give the boundary? No, you can draw one, for none has been drawn so far, but that never troubled you before when you used the word game, right? But then the use of the word is unregulated. The game we play with it is unregulated. It's not circumscribed by rules, but no more than there are any rules for how high one throws balls in tennis or how hard. Yet, tennis is a game for all, and all that, and has rules too. One might say that the concept game is a concept with blurred edges. How should we explain to someone what a game is? I imagine that we should describe games to him, and we might add this and similar things are called games. End quote. So it was a quite long passage, but I think also looking at the examples that are here on the sheet, you get an impression of how diverse that word is that we use, games, and how diverse the concept of play is at the same time. Wittgenstein used this to define the term language games, because the way language works looks a lot like how you describe the use of the word game. The meaning of a lot of words is their use. What should we take from this first definition problem? Well, first, that any definition of games or play, or any definition at all really, will miss some things that you're trying to describe, or will over-include things that you do not want to include. But secondly, that is not problematic, that definitions of this kind are necessarily defective, and you can still use words, so that problem is out of the way. Moving on then to a definition of games that's quite problematic, but is very exact, that of Johan Huizinga. In his book Homo Ludens, he tried to define the game. The book's still a classic, and I think it's relevant to this day. And if you want to use it, or you want to read it to deepen your understanding of video games, I really recommend only the first chapter is really crucial to it. The rest is more of an exposition of what's outlined in the first chapter, and then the later chapters. The last few chapters are also interesting as well, but they're more of a cultural philosophy than they are a philosophy of video games, or games in that sense. On page 28 of Homo Ludens, Huizinga gives his definition of play. Put it in full on the next slide. Play is a voluntary activity or occupation executed within certain fixed limits of time and place, according to rules freely accepted but absolutely binding, having its aim in itself, and accompanied by a feeling of tension, joy, and the consciousness that it is different from ordinary life. Let's unpack these characteristics. So it must be voluntary. Play is not forced. It must arise out of your own will. This will seems to be fundamental to play. It's what defines video games, right? The ability to act freely. If a teacher forces you to play, or God forbid, if you're ever in a team building event and you're forced to play, you'll find that life is sucked out of play. And if you're addicted to video games, you'll also find little joy in that addicted play itself. Play has fixed spaces and times. We build stadiums and theaters to mark off areas of play, and games have time limits and timers. A match of football is 90 minutes plus extra time. And we'll also build spaces to play video games in, be they online with Discord chats, Twitch servers around them, or if you're a man or a woman cave or whatever. There's spaces that we would define and mark off for play. 3, play is only possible by virtue of the rules that define them. What is and isn't real in the magic circle you've marked off for the game. The rules are freely accepted, but absolutely binding. You can't cheat or break the rules. That will make you a spoil sport. 4, and this is the crucial one, that's why I marked it out. Play has its aim in itself and is accompanied by a feeling of tension and joy. 5, it's also marked by consciousness that it's different from ordinary life. We can define play in opposition to seriousness. Out of these 5 characteristics, it's above all the 4th one that tells you something about why we play. Namely, that the reason for play is located within itself, that there is no ulterior motive. I've already seen someone in chat say it's like flow, perhaps. Yes, it is. But I'll go into it a bit more because it's the crucial one. I'll try to link Aristotle and Fortnite in the next session, so bear with me. Those sorts of arguments about why we perform certain actions are familiar to everyone who has ever read the Greek philosopher Aristotle, or about the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle did many things. He was a metaphysician. He was a natural philosopher. He wrote about poetry, about logic, etc. But he was also an ethicist, thinking about the actions that we do, right and wrong. And moreover, or most importantly, he was thinking about what a good life is, what a success, not the successful, that has a different connotation, what a fulfilled life is. And in trying to define that, he distinguished between actions that were performed in and for themselves, that which the Greeks call praxis, and actions that are performed for reasons outside themselves, which the Greeks call poiesis. I'll use a passage from the current thinker of the fatherland, the Denker des Vaderlands, who is also my old ethics professor at Radboud University, Paul van Tongeren, to describe first what poiesis is, so actions that are performed for reasons outside themselves. Quote, the most important characteristic of poiesis is that the purpose of the activity lies outside the activity itself. Suppose I'm making a table. Then the purpose of my activity, collecting the materials and putting them together, lies in that table. The table is not part of the activity itself. There's no sense in hammering after the table is finished, right? Ethics is not concerned with these sorts of activities. But what about praxis? It's telling that the example Van Tongeren uses is that of a game when he tries to define praxis. Quote, praxis is that form or that aspect of human activity of which the purpose lies in the activity itself. He who loves football will want to play football. Through playing, that is to say, in play, achieve his goal, namely to enjoy the game. That puts play, end quote. That puts play on the same level as a ton of other activities that do not require justification. You can think here of sports, art, culture, and probably you can name a couple of other things in the chat if you think about activities that have meaning in and for itself. Another example Van Tongeren always gave was the feeling of flow that you get when you're going for a jog. There's first this struggle of trying to getting into the run. Maybe you have a strained ankle and it's difficult to get into the run, but at some point you pass that and you get into a flow state, something that you want to continue for the sake of it, not something you lose the sense that you're doing this to get fit or whatever. You're getting into the flow state where you say, this is what I want to do for the sake of this experience. And that's the sort of activity that praxis is. So the sort of activity that you want to do for the sake of itself. Similarly, the reason why we have movies or why we make music resists the why question in a similar way that playing video games does. It's not for some other cause that we have these things. They are the ends to which we have all other, more serious stuff in life. And here I'm going to try to link a debt philosopher to Fortnite. Consider the activities that we miss out on because of COVID. Can't go to festivals, we can't go out into the city at night, can't go on road trips, we can't have themed house parties at our dorm. And perhaps the question isn't as much, have we been gaming more than before, but the question is, have we been gaming to substitute for all the other things that we can't do anymore that have that same ludic, that same game-like quality? Because many of the things that we valued in our pre-COVID lives are precisely that ludic or playful character. So consider how festivals, a notion that Huizinga even considers as a sort of alternative for play, as the fundamental category of culture. Consider how festivals are voluntary activities, fixed in time and space, according to rules freely accepted and absolutely binding, having its aim in itself and being marked off, sometimes even by fences and such, being marked off from ordinary life. You can go into festivals close to my heart, down the rabbit hole. Even the name suggests that you're going to dive into another world, which is outside space and time, outside of ordinary life, and that gives you absolute freedom to do whatever you want. That is play-like. And the same thing goes for nightlife and road trips and dorm parties. One of the games that we've been playing a lot over the last year is the famous battle royale game Fortnite then. A game that started out as a shooter in which 100 players are dropped on an island. I don't know if it's if it's useful. Let me scroll up. A lot of gamers in the chat. Board games, absolutely. I love board games. Board gamer here. Video game developer, okay. Sports, board games, into video games, all sorts of games. Cool. Okay, so perhaps it's not really necessary to explain what Fortnite is. Okay, Fortnite, battle royale game. You're dropped on an island. Only one can come out alive. That's the way I played it a couple of years back when it came out. But then it changed a lot, right? I think it's exemplary in the sense that it's trying to emulate all these other activities through crossover events with famous franchises like Star Wars and Marvel, but also by organizing events that emulate those festivals, those nights out, themed parties at a dorm, in the form of going to a Steve Aoki concert or going to see the new Netflix Nolan flick in theaters, which were all separate events that were organized by Fortnite. I think they called it Party Royale, the one of the events that was with the concerts. So there's that. The why might be the substitution of playful activities with playful activities in the virtual sphere. But Huizinga goes a bit further than Van Tongeren. Enjoyment does figure into his idea about why we play, but the practice of playing isn't exhausted by fun. So, and to push it even further, it's not that gaming is one of these elements It's not one of these things alongside music, alongside movies, etc. It has its own category, and it's much more fundamental, and we'll dive into a bit into why that is. But first, I can hear you think, hey, there are other reasons for play. I haven't seen it in the chat, so perhaps it's not one of the ideas you had. But here it goes anyway. Play can be a form of poiesis, something that has uses outside of play. And Huizinga has clearly considered that line of thinking because he spends the first few pages on the book on these ideas about play. He talks about the educational function of play and the physiological effects of play. And I think I should go into them because you'll hear these a lot. Especially, I work in a university environment, and every so often there will be a session on how you can use games to improve learning, right? Perhaps some people in the chat are even involved in that, trying to gamify learning experiences. Serious games as well. My game, the game I made, Demos, had that same function. It was a game to be used in vocational training for citizenship, civic education. So the argument is as follows. We learn to play. Play has a pedagogical function. This is perhaps the most common idea behind the reasons for play. And the basic idea comes from evolutionary psychology. And that idea of evolutionary psychology is that we think certain things, but actually evolution tells you to think those things. In this case, you're mistaken that you play for fun. Well, in fact, play is only fun because it rewards a process that teaches young animals, and we are young animals, useful skills. So these dogs, they bite each other, and these puppies, they bite each other, but they hold back, so they don't really hurt each other. They play sort of hide and seek games. They jump one another, so try to surprise the other with a skillful jump, and they really seem to be having fun, but they're not doing it for fun. They're doing it because evolution has rewarded that sort of behavior, and the fun is only an epiphenomenon. It's something that is not the effect of the cause that is fun, but it's actually the cause that sorts the effect fun. In other words, we play because in the struggle for survival, gamers have lucked out until now. That could be an argument, but Huizinga rejects it. Similar argument is the argument that we play for its physiological effects. It's a different way of telling the same story by using a language that was unavailable to Huizinga, obviously, in the 1930s. But it's really in vogue now, so you'll see this language also when you look at the psychology of video games. And that's the language of neuroscience. The body produces different hormones when we play: dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins. I don't know what these mean, so I can't tell you much about it, but that's what these are called, the luck hormones. And you'll often see headlines in newspapers and such. They'll say, oh, the reward system in the brain, it's triggered in the same way as a coke addict is triggered when he gets a hit, right? Those are the sort of nonsensical headlines that you often see. And maybe perhaps that's sort of psychologically, neuroscientifically true, but it tells you nothing about play. And we'll see why Huizinga thinks that. I watched part of the previous lecture in this series, and I noticed that the speaker had a sort of similar argument. He wanted to add to the list an instrumental reason for play, namely that play is a social lubricant. So you have this whole world of social relations, which are, if you take this perspective seriously, the real things that humans do in social gatherings is all serious, and then to make that more effective, the argument would be there's play. It's like sort of the oil that makes the engine run. There's no the social lubricant isn't the goal of life. It's not the thing why the engine runs. It's only there to make the engine run smoother. It's only there to make social life run smoother. As if you'd be on a party and someone suggests playing a game, it's like putting social life on hold, making it run smoother because of the game, and then returning to the stuff that's valuable in life, right? That will be the argument. Not to dump on the previous speaker because the talk was excellent, but I think this is exactly the sort of argument that Huizinga tries to reject with this argument. And the argument here is that it doesn't take seriously the experience of the player. It doesn't take seriously the experience of why we play these games, of what these play experiences mean to the player. And Huizinga invites you to do a sort of thought experiment, and I'm inviting you to do it with us. Imagine that we live in a game, or live in a game. Imagine that we live in a world where imagine that we live in a world that is completely determined by physical effects. It's completely deterministic, as we say. A world that has evolutionary effects and psychological responses, but there's one thing missing in this world, that is the experience of play. So when dogs try to go for pedagogical effects and play for that, the evolution plays out in the same way, or when and all the physiological these hormones are released in the same way, but there's not the conscious experience of play. You could even expand the thought experiment and say there's no consciousness at all. It's completely stripped from the world. Then the argument Huizinga makes is that that world will be functionally identical. It will function all the same. There's no, if you really say that the fun experience or the fun consciousness has no merit of its own, if it has no function, if it's stripped from the function that play performs, then we might as well lose it. And Huizinga reverses the argument. He says, no, that in itself should tell you that that category is of vital importance. I think he's right. You could also, because if you could also reverse the argument, right? If you'd have the choice to strip all these things of the world, what would you think? What would you keep? If you'd have the opportunity to that fun experience, that is what you're doing it for. That's the main point here. So we've gathered I'd say the most important points almost from Huizinga. We're going to move on to a third, introduce a third thinker. So we play for reasons that are intrinsic to play, and we substitute the ludic features of our ordinary life with video games. And I'd say that's a pretty reasonable first result for our inquiry into why we play. We can press Huizinga just a bit further. So we go back to his definition of play. But now we're going to stress a different part of that quote. So play is the voluntary activity, la di da da da. And then we're going to come to the final sentence of this quote. The consciousness that it is different from ordinary life, that separation of it. Let's focus now on that part of the definition. The idea that play is different from ordinary life. It's really on this feature of play that Huizinga's most daring argument is based. That play isn't one of the elements of culture. It's not one alongside the other elements of culture, but that play is one, if not the constitutive, if not the constitutive element of higher culture. I should take this really seriously. So higher culture here means a lot of these really important things that we ascribe to higher culture. In order to make that argument, though, he needs to carve out a piece of human life specifically for play. So he needs to reserve a space in his anthropology for it. And rather than go into detail about or use the words that Huizinga used for that, I'm going to borrow someone else's words, namely those of Hannah Arendt, who rejected the term philosopher. So I'm gonna call her a thinker. And Hannah Arendt wrote a book in 1958 called The Human Condition. And in that book, she tried to not only categorize the forms of human activity, but also rank them. In a similar vein as Aristotle was thinking about what a good life is, Hannah Arendt was also trying to think what a good life is and to rank the sorts of activities that we can do on a scale from not important to important. But in doing so, she flipped a couple of philosophical commonplaces, things that were taken for granted. She flipped around. So a lot of philosophers are tempted to say that the thinking life, or vita contemplativa, as she calls it, is the most important form of life. So to think and to contemplate about what is happening in our lives, that is the sort of end goal of what life is oriented towards. And opposed to that thinking is that thinking life is the vita activa, or the active life, which he then subdivides into 3 different types of activity that we can use for to carve out a place for play. First, there's labor, the unceremonious activity we need to do to sustain our mortal bodies and to keep ourselves alive. Examples of that include putting on clothes in the morning, working on a farm, doing dishes. Then there's work, the noble work we do to create artifacts that put us man above labor, building a house, building a machine that will make it easier to produce food, assembling a dishwasher so you don't have to do the dishes anymore, etc. It's what we do to make the world a more habitable place for man. But at the top of the pyramid of human activity is what Arendt called action. And action has a lot of qualities that we should recognize in play. Action is life in its biological sense. Action is the way that we enter into the world of man. Action is not defined by necessity or need. It is beyond that. Action is spontaneous. It's taking initiative, originating, being free. Here's that category of freedom again. Action is taking part in the web of human relations and stories that we are part of as individuals. Action is presenting yourself on the stage of life, disclosing your identity in the process. And action is unpredictable because we can never predict the outcomes of our actions in the web of human relations. And action is irreversible because we can, after having performed on that stage, never take back what actions or effects we had on the network of human beings that we came in touch with. What Arendt tries to do here is carve out a piece of anthropological space for political activities. That was her goal in trying to define this. So what she's thinking of is the Greek citizen going out onto the forum and participating in political life after having done away with the need to do labor and work. If that's the sort of life that people that have the opportunity find worth living, then maybe there is something to it, right? Maybe that's the sort of life that's worth living. That's the sort of thing that action represents. And I think in the same category, I think you could substitute action there for the word play in Huizinga's idea. So similarly, free action, the exercise of your volitional abilities, presenting in that movement also yourself, carving out a piece of identity in that way by use of your actions in that play space. And I think you can do a similar thought experiment as we did just now. If you had the opportunity, Arendt argues, these would be the sorts of activities that you would fill your life with if you'd really have the chance. And play is one of those activities. Or video games would be perhaps one of those activities, but play would definitely be one of those. The real world, Arendt is telling us in short, is out there and amongst other people. It's in the space between human beings that we find the human world at its most valuable. And if that's not a lesson we've learned during the pandemic, I don't know what is. And I realize that this sounds a bit like it's not about the treasure, it's about the friends we made along the way, but it really is at this in this story. Huizinga's bold claim then. I've already mentioned that Huizinga's idea about play and as a praxis go further than that simple notion of having fun or enjoying oneself. It might be accurate to say that we do a lot of gaming for fun, but it would be too simple to say that we only play for fun. And this is where Huizinga's theories become both exciting and provocative. What play does in this lifeless world of instrumental arguments is to introduce or start a human world. He says, in acknowledging play, you acknowledge mind. So the fact that your consciousness, your experience of the world matters, and that if that experiences or that consciousness is fun, has enjoyment in it, has tension in it, that matters. If humans have the ability to voluntarily bracket off a piece of reality in space and time, separate it from the demands of labor and work, and devote it entirely to a goal that lies in itself and fosters social bonds, then that human ability, Huizinga argues, is a good foundation for all other higher forms of culture. And to those higher forms of culture, Huizinga counts law, war even, poetry, art, politics, philosophy, religion, wisdom. And these are, you can map these to the different chapters of the book where he goes into or explains how play underpins or founds all these different categories of social human life. So man must first overcome the physical needs of his existence, labor and work, to use Arendt's terminology, to create a space in his life for this domain of play action. And in all these domains, we create spaces and places for the voluntary activities, participation in activities that have their aims in themselves, are guided by rules and are absolutely binding, and that create social bonds. In a way, the games and the video games that we consider in this lecture are the least interesting of these ludic elements of culture because they are so openly ludic. Because games are so openly ludic, they sometimes cross over into the terrain of the trivial or the banal. So the stuff that's not, well, you don't need to be high culture, but it that doesn't trigger that that core element of what it means to be human. I see that too when people are asked why they started playing more in the pandemic. A lot of them, it's even the most given answer in a survey that I found, it's to combat boredom. So it might be just a throwaway game of Call of Duty, or it might be a game that you play just before dinner of Fall Guys or whatever. And it might seem that that's only to combat boredom, and it might not seem to fit with that story of higher culture. But I hope I can turn you in the last part of the lecture to entice you to think of that in another way as well. So let's look take a closer look at the sorts of games we've started to play. I've already mentioned Fortnite. Oh, there we are. I've already mentioned Fortnite, but when we look at the stats, we can see that there's a number of games that have drawn new crowds as well. The Nielsen company, that's a company that also does measurements of television ratings. They also keep track of what games we play and started playing. And it shouldn't surprise anyone, I think, that the games we started playing most are multiplayer games. Games also that we've been playing for a long time. So there's a lot of familiar games on this list. So both in Nielsen's list and Steam's most played list and so on, you see games like Fortnite, Among Us, Fall Guys, GTA 5, Call of Duty Warzone, FIFA, Counter-Strike, Global Offensive, Dota 2, Minecraft, and a couple of games, or especially the games that are big in, I think it's in China. I don't even know them. Peacekeeping Elite. This was Kings, something with Kings. It's the biggest game right now, apparently. It's not really in this area, I guess, or not really in my bubble. And then there's Roblox, which fell off my radar, but when I started Googling it, there were a lot of warnings for parents, so I guess it's a kids game with microtransactions in it. And it's apparently also a game where you can make games within it. I haven't tried it yet, so forgive me. And with what we've said so far, I think it's easy to see why we turn to these games, right? These games bring people together in forms that most strictly match, I think, Huizinga's definition of play. They're social from the beginning, from the get-go. So you got that going for it. And more specifically, they take the form of a competition for something. They really relate to what Huizinga defines by the Greek term agon, a competition for something. And some of them, so paradoxically, these are the games we turn to, but they also seem the most to fit the category of distractions, amusement. They might seem like simple entertainment in a lot of senses. And of course, a lot of these games that you play are also that, but we'll zoom out in a minute and hopefully you'll see that there's more going on that meets the eye in a simple play session. Single player games, on the other hand, that we started playing more. Games such as Cyberpunk, The Last of Us 2, Doom Eternal, my current favorite, Disco Elysium. It's a bit more difficult to see why we started playing these games. If they were our only category, it would be difficult to see, using Huizinga's story, why it's especially these games that we started playing more as well. But they do take the form that Huizinga defines as representations of something. So they're more artful in the sense that they represent a sort of play that you might see in a theater play or in maybe a church session. A ceremony in church has the same representation of something character. It's like it's a collection of references to the outside world, but then transformed in a symbolic order. But from this point out, Huizinga is not really of much use anymore, so we'll leave him aside. And when we try to analyze that fun category in these games any further, we find that Huizinga writes, quote, "The fun of playing resists all analysis, all logical interpretation. As a concept, it cannot be reduced to any other mental category. So we must turn to someone else." And also, our search through games, I think, perhaps you looked at these pictures and say, that's not the game for me. And I think this lecture showed already that not every game is fun. That only specific kinds of games are fun to you. And that they're only fun at certain times. And perhaps also that they're only fun with specific types of people, specific people you know. And a game theorist and designer called Bernie de Koven recognized this some 40 years after the publication of Homo Ludens. In his book, The Well-Played Game, he searches for well-played games. Well-played game, he writes, is a game that becomes excellent because of the way it is being played. It's not in itself a well-played game. It's not because of the game, but because of the way it's being played. And it's a fascinating read, this book. If you're, can't say to really recommend it. Do I? Perhaps I do. I don't know. I'll give you a taste of what it's like, and then you can decide for yourself. Because he used what I would call a phenomenological approach. That is a phenomenological. Shall I write it in the chat, perhaps? Phenomenological. Difficult word. It's the study of phenomenon. The study of how things are experienced by subjects, by individuals. And in this approach, he reads like a stream of consciousness novel. And let me read a passage so you get an idea of how he works. This is from the first chapter. Quote, how about a little game of ping pong? Ping pong's my game, you know? Well, I'm not that good at in it all the time, but I've played it well. Should we volley first, just so we can get used to the game again? Yeah, I like the way it's beginning to feel, don't you? Want to volley for serve? Well, I mean, as long as we're trying to figure out what a well-played game is, we might as well make a little game out of this. All right, nice shot. Really surprised how well I'm playing today. Oh, sorry, I thought it was my serve. Okay, now it's starting to feel good. Good slam. How about for a return? Look at this. I'm playing faster than I can think. I didn't even catch myself deciding to hit the ball there. I just did it. Playing out of pure presence, almost just happening to be there, exactly where I should be. Just happening to hit it back to you exactly where I should be. Just happening to hit back to you exactly where I should be hitting. And look at you. Returning everything I try, even my fanciest. My shots are reserved only for the stiffest competition. Now, do you know what a well-played game is? Sure, I won and all that, but even so, you have to admit it was well played. It was what we were looking for. But why are you looking at me that way? Oh, you were playing with your wrong hand. So here you see this analysis of how you flow in and out of a good game, a well-played game. So here he starts from the experience of the gamer himself in this instance and takes that seriously. Perhaps we could pause for just a minute and think about the games that we think are well played. They might very well be the sorts of games that de Koven identifies in his book. There's a lot in there, but I think these are the things I picked from it that really spoke to me. Games that are equal, a fair chance of winning, games that challenge us, games that we keep going, games that we can change or end in a timely fashion, and importantly, we'll have that on a separate slide. This was meant for the ping pong story, obviously. Games that foster a play community. For the sake of time and the purpose of this lecture, I'll single out only that last quality of this set, the play community, because it fits so well with the way that we started consuming games. I think in the last decade it really took off, but been doing it for quite a while, but it really fits well with how we've been doing it for the last decade. So going to a single player game, because that was the more difficult category of explaining. Suppose I play a session of Disco Elysium. It's a wonderful RPG where you wake up in a hostel room that you trashed, and from there it gets crazier and crazier. Really warmly recommended. Not affiliated. I don't have shares in stock in them. But anyway, it's a good game. And there will be two ways for me to analyze where the fun is or where the culture is in that act of play, in that 10-minute window that I was playing this game. One way would be to zoom in, as it were, and find the culture in the cultural artifact or in the cultural act that I'm performing. So I could look at the 10-minute session, identify maybe in a De Koven style where I enjoyed myself. Was it at the beginning when I didn't really know what was going on, or was it at the part that I started speaking to a ceiling fan, or was it in the end when I got bored and distracted and went to do something else, or get frustrated because I didn't know where to go in this point and click RPG. Well, that would be one way to go about it, but I could go even deeper and maybe watch YouTube videos on how this game was made, how specific parts of it were designed, to get an even better sense of where the fun was in that game, to deepen my understanding. But that's not what I'm trying to get at here, and that's not where the play community comes in. That's when we zoom out. So first you'd say, well, perhaps that 10-minute window is part of you playing the larger game. Well, sure. I could zoom out a bit more. Where does that playing fit a role in? Where does my distracted game of Fall Guys before dinner, where does that figure into my larger life? Well, that's where we get into, I've used this really cliche image of a water cooler because I like the metaphor of the water cooler, a place where you can talk to people who share similar interest and talk to them about your hobby. And that's also, I think, where Twitch is plays an important role. It's sort of hangout space where you can go if you like video games, but it's also picked up for D&D. I think a lot of people stream their D&D sessions. It's where you get the sense that there's other people sharing in this interest. Perhaps where you can talk to people about that 10-minute session of Disco Elysium, compare how your playthrough of that 10-minute session related to theirs. And I think your play is also really affected by the people you talk to, which games you pick up, how you approach each game, whether you finish those games or not, whether you play them years later. Those are all affected by that dynamic. And zooming out even further, there's a larger gaming culture that has its own events and institutions. So the Game Awards, E3, GDC, the Games Developers Conference, they have a lot of excellent videos in their vault as well. Games Done Quick, websites that review video games. And you see how this culture feeds back into the way we play games. So we play the games that win awards, that are analyzed on YouTube channels, that are reviewed well. And when we play them differently because of the way we talk about those games with other people. So some of you might dedicate themselves to speedrunning, breaking the boundaries of the game to finish them as quick as possible. But then you'll see that there's also this dynamic where game designer will watch the speedrun videos and generate a sort of dialectic of game design, where video or playing is influenced by performing those plays in a larger environment, and well, you get the point. And it's at this level that we find the play communities that De Koven writes about. De Koven gives the example simply of a group of people, let's say 10 people playing a game of tag or hide and seek. It's a really sort of, if you go do the mental exercise of taking a thought experiment of how that goes, or maybe perform such an experiment tomorrow, you see that the game you're playing, evolves because of the wishes of the players. You might change or decide to break one of the rules, as you might decide to mod the game that you're playing, maybe make your own, and change the game up in that way. And at that point, when the play communities starts to be more important than the game you're playing, that's, I think, where de Koven says that's where the fun lies. And I think with Huizinga in mind, we should say that's also where the culture comes in. So where that anthropological, that human desire to play really is triggered or fulfilled. Okay, almost nearing the end of the lecture. We also see game designers anticipating the development of game communities. That's an obvious thing. But more recent development is the idea that games can have seasons, where the ebb and flow of how new features, skins, emotes are introduced follow the flow of interest of gamers. And zooming out, obviously, we arrive at this lecture, which represents the highest level of gaming culture, obviously. We reflect back on gaming culture in its abstract sense. And with that humble last point, I'm going to go to the summary slide, summary of this talk. No definition of play will ever do. Play has no aim in itself. Video games substitute our habitual forms of play. We play because we play. In play, we transcend bare life. Video games provide opportunities for rich play, and part of what we call play happens in between games. That's it.
Thank you, Stefan. I'm going to stop your presentation for a bit so we can see you again. Thanks a lot. For the people still here, you can ask your questions. Please write them down first in the chat and I'll get to you. During the talk, if you couldn't stop me from thinking about this playful element in, well, as what Johan Huizinga describes as play. In a way, I was thinking, do we still have this playful element in modern life? Did we eliminate it perhaps by, I don't know, economic thinking, in education, but also in science, in art? There's little room for this playful, free space where you can just, I don't know, the Dutch word aanmodderen. I can write English translation. What would Huizinga say about this modern way of thinking about play?
I think there's actually texts of Huizinga that go into this phenomenon that I haven't consulted for this lecture, but I think it's both his earlier work and his later work where he's taking this sort of culturally pessimistic view, which is, so this book, the Homo Ludens, is from 1938, so there were reasons that he didn't know about when he published the book to be culturally pessimistic, to make an understatement. But definitely, so one of the main points of this cultural philosophy that Huizinga tried to develop was the idea that modern culture, of modernization, the advancements of technology, they disrupted a lot of the playful elements of everything, really. He gives examples in Homo Ludens in the last chapter, where he says it's, for instance, in business, you could imagine perhaps guilds in the Middle Ages, which he wrote about extensively, having a sort of playful dealing with how they went about their business. There could be room for spectacle, for fair dealings, right? You know, you could come to rules about how to go about in business. But in his time already, he'd seen that the advancements of industrialization and capitalism had come together to crush that spirit. So in economics as well as in war and love, all is fair, right? But that's exactly what's opposite to the gaming or the playing sphere, where there are rules to precisely bound what we want to do within that game space. So we can't. That's precisely the point. Also, with the comparison with dogs, right? In playing, you don't really bite to kill, and that is really lost in culture. I think Huizinga would agree. But it's not really part of. That's a broader story about society, really. Yeah.
Yeah. There are some questions popping up in the chat. You are able to use your microphones now. This I kindly want to ask you, Laura, for instance, to share your question in person. So we get a sense of that there is actually an audience on the other side of our screens. Laura, could you pose your question, please?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi.
Yeah. Thanks, Stefan. Thanks for your presentation. It was really interesting. I'm just wondering why, in your opinion, people enjoy so much games with slot mechanics, especially lately mobile games. I work in the industry as a data analyst, and I cure data coming from these kind of games. And I always wondered why, and it would be nice to hear your opinion. Sorry?
Yeah, why that is the case. I was trying to finish your sentence, but that doesn't really work.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not really an expert on this. Probably you are more than I am. So forgive me if it doesn't really answer the question. But what I heard from about slot machines is that they once tried in, I think it was Australia, to ban the lights and sounds on slot machines. And that was apparently detrimental to the use of these machines. And that would point, that's the argument, that will point to the fact that it's the lights and the sounds. So it goes to a very rudimentary part of the human mind to be triggered by those lights and blinking effects. It's a lot of its UI design, right? Making, and the same thing goes for mobile games, Candy Crush and so on, to make it blinking to trigger sort of really rudimentary parts of the human brain to get them enticed for the game. But that story about Australian slot machines would say that would point to the fact that it's not really the gambling aspect of it, right? That's a very interesting. That would be an interesting theory to check. You could make an
indeed.
Yeah,
I was because maybe in what I tend to do when I play this kind of mobile games is turn off the sound.
Okay.
So so I can imagine that not most of the people, but some users definitely do also, because maybe they play at some inconvenient times where the sound cannot be played. So there might definitely be some digging in to do.
Yeah, it would be. I think it's a puzzle for Huizinga. Why that precisely would be an interesting form of play. Yeah, it poses a puzzle for him, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Perhaps
Thanks. I'll
a story where a larger play community comes in and it gains meaning in that sense. But I'm not sure if that's the case either.
Yeah, could be. Thanks. I'll definitely check into some theories behind this. Thanks.
I'm sorry, that doesn't really answer the question.
Thank you, Laura.
It was nice to.
Thank you, Laura. I wanted to go to Xiaoming. Could you pose your question?
Yeah, first of all, thanks indeed for the presentation. And my question is, like, I was always wondering, like, when the kids, when we are like at very young age, there is no way that people communicate throughout cultures. But amazingly, like who are the games like we played in the very early stage of our childhood are all similar if you look worldwide, like yo-yo glass and wheel clap hands or some like simple and easy. And if you communicate with friends, like what do you play when you're young, like they are kind of all similar and we are all do the same things. And what do you think is that?
That's also an interesting question. Thank you for that. So I have a 1-year-old son, as Nina found out when we did the sound check for this lecture, and I'd be curious to see that as well. And I know that my son he plays games that are extensions of his body, in the sense that it's just interactions that he naturally runs into by trying to define define the use of his limbs and so on. And then obviously also things that we introduce to our children. So you could go two ways, I think, with this argument. You could try to take a cultural anthropology approach and say, how does culture reproduce itself on a global scale, which it does. We saw it in the last lecture in this series as well. There's a lot of similarity in the sorts of games that you find in different places. Maybe you could draw analogies with the idea that writing, just the phenomenon of script has popped up in several places in the world independently of each other. So there's just something about the way the humans relate to the natural world that that comes up naturally. But you could also go the route that there's an exchange of all these cultural phenomena, all these games, really, that we transmit them, perhaps via trade and so on, and then we transmit them to children. But I think the essence of what drives children to play is simply that they also already have an inkling of that's a valuable way to spend their time. Precisely in young children, it's very tempting to go that route, right? It's an evolutionary thing. It's completely biology. It's not culture. It's definitely not consciousness, right? This is a sort of a trope in philosophy. Children don't have minds. Only adults have minds, right? Animals don't have minds either. A lot of philosophers have made that call, but I think they're wrong. And Huizinga says as much. Like the fact that animals and children play shows you their consciousness. So it's not that classic mirror experiment that they always say is the proof of animal consciousness in dolphins or whatever. Consciousness in its basic form, the experience of a will, I think that's apparent in children and animals all the same. That you don't have a recollection of your childhood volition doesn't say it's not there. Long-winded answer to a short small question.
Thank you. Bernd, you posed a question, but I don't know if it was a reaction to someone else, but you were very active in the chat, so maybe you want to react anyway. Bernd?
Yes,
Hi.
hello.
Hi. Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm actually a game design teacher.
Cool.
Nice.
So I know a few things.
So your tips in the chat as well. Reading suggestions. Thanks.
Calais is also recommended to read. Man Gamble Plays.
Thanks.
The whole point I was actually making or wanting to make is that we as social mammals, we learn by playing. And at some point in our upbringing, it's getting stigmatized as a waste of time. And it's simply not. I'm pretty much gaming since I'm 11. Also, not the child-friendly stuff.
Okay.
Didn't happen so much so far. But yeah, I see only benefits. During the COVID crisis, I was able to hold longer and persevere better than my colleagues.
Because of play. Because of gaming.
Yeah, because of deep focus. That's what you kind of need.
Thanks, Bernd. Great to hear that you enjoyed the talk. I think we should answer the last question. Maybe I wrote down a few. I think it follow-ups on the first question I had. I was still thinking of the 3 points Hannah Arendt made. So first point would be labor, work, and then action. Now, a lot of jobs are disappearing, are replaced by, I don't know, computers, whatever. And maybe we will end up in a world where basic income will be the standard. So what if we don't? What if the aspect of work will disappear? How would there ever be more time for play, or how do you think that world would look like?
Well, I think that's a fun thought experiment, right? It would be it would be a fun fun theme for a game, utopian of play, right? I always think when I was thinking of this before the lecture as well, what kind of world would that look like? And I had to think about Star Trek. They've solved the problem of labor in the Star Trek universe. There's infinite energy, and they can, if you need food, you can just press a button on a microwave, and the food in the microwave. So there's no. What do these guys do in Star Trek? They go about playing in the universe. Really, the universe is their playground. And on a more modest scale, I think if we would have universal basic income, it would be tempting to say that we would start playing, but I think the more important thing is that we would start bringing the playful elements back into things that are really serious, or to contrast them with really serious things. It would, in other words, it would take the edge of business competition, right? If there's no existential threat to your life if your business fails, then you could have a much more relaxed relationship to that business. Or if that's the most important example that I can think of just now. But also would bring the sport back into a lot of other activities as well, that are now really serious-fied.
Yeah. Well, that's a good thought experiment for
We'll talk about Jaeger right in the chat.
Thanks a lot, Stefan, for your effort and then great lecture. And thanks anyone for joining. Exactly in a week, we will have the last lecture in this series by Angus Moll. Thanks a lot and have a great evening.
Thanks for having me. See you. Nice evening.
See you. Bye.